Scientists said it couldn't be done. Lawyers said it shouldn't be done. And Rampy said it will be done. Over the next 100 days, I'm going to do what John Hammond's millions of dollars and zero safety regulations couldn't do, and build Jurassic Park from the ground up. Dinosaurs, disaster, probably a few lawsuits. It's going to be an action-packed journey. Will I succeed, or will, as always, life find a way to meddle with my plans?
Hi, how are you?
Well, to tell you guys this story, we're going to have to go back to day one. Our story begins on Isla Nublar in 1993. There were the beginnings of a park here, but in this universe, John Hammond managed to stop himself from opening the park just in time, which hopefully means that there's no Dennis Nedrys hanging around these parts.
What do you want? What do you want? You want food?
I had been given a $9 million budget to bring Jurassic Park to life, which might sound like a lot here, but dinosaurs do not come cheap. The first thing I would need to do here though, after taking a good look at what Hammond had left me of course, was to place down an expedition centre, so that we can start to look for some fossils. I then needed a team of scientists, and the starter scientists that wanted to come and work at a dinosaur theme park, which didn't have any actual dinosaurs yet, were pretty scarce, but these ones would have to do for now. Once I hired my team of scientists, I was able to access dig sites, where I would be able to dig for fossils. So I sent out an expedition team to the US to search for some Ceratosaurus fossils, and once they came back I extracted the DNA, and before you knew it I was able to make myself a Ceratosaurus. These would be our first attractions on display at my Jurassic Park, and we would have 4 of them. They certainly however did not come cheap though, and almost half our budget had already disappeared. I was planning on placing these Ceratosaurus down at the bottom of the park, as we already had a fully operational park tour down here, just like in the original Jurassic Park. I had them airlifted to there from the hatchery, as there was no point in wasting additional money on a hatchery down there after all. While they were being transported, I made sure to sort out the electricity, as I've already seen what happens when the power goes out in Jurassic Park, and it wasn't pretty. I also added a response facility down the bottom, who would look after the Ceratosaurs, and then immediately began work on our next creature, which would be the Deinonychus. I incubated a big batch of them, and decided to put them down the bottom of the park also, in a nearby enclosure to the Ceratosaurs, as the guests would be able to enjoy them on the park tour, and there would be less chance of them breaking out and eating a guest. While I waited for them to be delivered, I decided to check on the Ceratosaurs and the Jeep tour. I was slightly concerned about the safety element of just having all these vehicles stroll on by, past one of the most deadly carnivores to ever walk the earth, but hey, half the fun of visiting Jurassic Park is the possibility of getting eaten, right? Whatever the safety concerns, there was no doubt that we now had some actual dinosaurs, which meant that we were actually starting to attract in some guests. So that meant I had to correctly configure my amenities, so they would actually make me some profit. After sorting those out, I checked in on our new arrivals to make sure they were settling in okay, and was pleased to see that they were. So I then sent out another dig team for some Moros Intrepidus DNA. This tiny little Tyrannosaur loved everything and everyone, so it would be a great addition to the park, as it would be flexible where I could put it. My scientists, however, were a little bit tired after this trip away, so I decided to give them some rest time. And while my scientists were taking a rest, I decided to actually take one with them, so that I could play some Crystal of Atlan. Crystal of Atlan is today's sponsor, and it is a fantastic brand new cross-platform MMO action RPG game, playable on iOS, Android and PC. In Crystal of Atlan, players can immerse themselves as members of Thornbird Adventurers Guild, and uncover the secrets of the Crystal of Atlan with the team. Pre-registrations are now open, and by signing up using my link in the description, you can not only get access to exclusive rewards, but also unlock early access to the game. One thing that I love about Crystal of Atlan is its smooth combat system, where each individual combo leads to a different outcome. I'm also a huge fan of the multiple classes, which refreshingly are all unlocked from the start, but where I think the most enjoyment can be had is via the multiplayer capability. I love a multiplayer game that you can play with friends, and in Crystal of Atlan you can team up with friends to tackle co-op dungeons, participate in guild activities, and engage in PvP battles, fostering a vibrant online community. If all this isn't enough to persuade you to pre-register, then I have to tell you that by registering and inviting friends, you can collect summon tickets for a chance to win amazing prizes such as the iPhone 16 Pro Max 1TB, Apple Watch Ultra 2, AirPods Max, PlayStation 5 Pro, and so much more. The more summon tickets players have, the higher the chances you have of winning. So what are you waiting for, my dear Rampy army? Please do go and check out Crystal of Atlan using the link in the description and pre-register now. Not only will you be getting early access to a super promising brand new RPG and opportunity to win amazing prizes, but you will also be helping to support the channel. Thanks once again to the folks at Crystal of Atlan for sponsoring this video. I extracted the Moros Intrepidus DNA from the fossils, and yes, feel free to cook me in the comments if I got that wrong, and this gave us enough DNA to be able to cook up some own in our lab. I then placed down an emergency shelter, which helps to increase Jurassic Park's safety rating, which we are of course famous for around here.
Are you sure about that?
After doing that, I was sat in my office when I was given a contract from my investors, who promised me money if I met a certain objective. I opted to choose to increase the park rating one, as it gave me more money, and I was pretty sure that we'd be able to get that park rating up in no time at all, especially as we had new dinosaurs arriving all the time. The guests were in need of some toilets, so I placed down a solitary restroom to satisfy their needs, and then got round to cooking up some good old tiny tyrannosaurs in the lab. While they were incubating, I realised that I'd actually been depriving my poor Deinonychuses of some water, so I quickly rectified that in the hopes that it would stop them escaping in search of some. But after that, I got a very interesting notification. I was offered the chance to capture some Styracosauruses for a small fee, and I was not about to turn down some almost free dinosaurs. I also had an enclosure ready just for them, which I decided would be very good for herbivores considering it was right next to the guests. Putting a Tyrannosaur in here didn't seem like the smartest of moves. While I was waiting on our new arrivals to be delivered, I placed down a viewing gallery and then checked out Jurassic Park statistics to see what I could do to make our park appeal to some more people. Our appeal rating was obviously low, which was largely due to the lack of species variety we had in the park, but obviously we would be improving this over time. The good news was that our Moros Intrepidus had arrived in the park, but the bad news was that these small things were so small I was slightly concerned that the guests wouldn't even be able to see them.
I can deny it no longer! I am small.
So it was time to turn our attention to a Jurassic Park favourite, the Velociraptor. After all, you cannot rebuild Jurassic Park without having a pack of raptors. So I sent away a dig team to Mongolia to look for that precious DNA, and when they were back, I extracted the DNA. They didn't get me quite enough DNA to actually make any raptors yet, which I was fine with, as I wanted to make sure that I had the strongest fences in the game unlocked before we brought any raptors into Jurassic Park. Our Styracosaurus army were about to be delivered, so I made some touches to their enclosure and then placed down a small hotel, so that our guests would be able to have some accommodation if they wanted to stay at Jurassic Park overnight. But next, it was time to create another park tour. So far we had two of these, one to transport to and from the park entrance, and the second one which went down right to the bottom of the park, where we currently of course had our Deinonychus and Ceratosauruses. This one however would go around the top of the park, where our guests would be mainly situated, and would be where the majority of our dinosaurs were, eventually. This would also give our guests a great view of the new Styracosaurus up close, and they were about to have some company actually, as I was given the opportunity to capture some Nasutoceratops in the wild, which I gratefully accepted and placed in the same enclosure as the Styracosauruses, as apparently these two species get along well. Next, it was time to send out a dig team to Argentina for some Herrerasaurus DNA. I was intent on having all the original creatures that were in the original park in my recreation, and Herrerasauruses were one of these, so I got to work on cooking some up in the lab, and once they were ready, I put them into one of the nearby pre-made enclosures that would be already on the park tour route, as I knew I needed some star attractions for the guests to watch. As we'd expanded our park quite a lot at this point and had far more guests in it, I placed down a medium amenity and decided to sell action figures from it. And this was actually a hit with the park guests, which just helped me to rake in a little bit more of that precious cashola. Which was a good job as we had been flying through money lately. Hopefully our latest attraction, which of course was the Herrerasaurus, would help to drive up sales, even if they apparently didn't like moving out of the way for the park tour. Although they did eventually move out of the way, as they were now busy fighting for dominance amongst each other, which I'm sure made it great viewing for our new guests on the park tour ride. I decided to name the one that fights and thus the alpha of the pack, Dennis. Checking back in on our Moros Intrepiduses, I was slightly confused to see that one of them was actually starving, when it was seemingly right next to a big pile of meat. But I think its little legs were just so small that it had taken a nap and was then slowly making its way over to the food. I also added some sand for our little Tyrannosaurs to keep them happy, for realising that one of our park tour vehicles was missing a door, which was rather concerning to say the least.
Help me! Help me!
Apparently though, this seemed to be a new trend,
I'm big and heavier.
as it wasn't the only vehicle without all its doors. As always, at Jurassic Park, we take your safety very seriously. And back on our expedition radar, a new fossil had become available, the Dilophosaurus. So I sent out a team to handle that, extracted some of my old fossils, and then started to look at the Dilophosaurus DNA. Obviously one of the most iconic dinosaurs in JP history, but hopefully none of my scientists will be getting eaten by this thing anytime soon. Unfortunately, however, I was now a little bit poor and couldn't actually afford to incubate all 8 Dilophosaur eggs at this very time. Although a new contract did come in shortly after, which would provide me with a nice cash increase. Unfortunately though, 150k was going straight out to the rest of my scientists, who I had to look after or they would sabotage Jurassic Park. Not sure where they were going for 150k, must have been the Maldives or something, but it wasn't worth the risk of them turning the fences off. As we had more people through the doors now, I decided to remove our small amenities and place down 2 new medium ones. However, before I could get the opportunity to finish that up, I was told we had the chance to catch some more Styracosaurs. I decided to actually turn this chance down though, considering we were already being penalised for a lack of species variety, and I didn't want to make this any worse. I finished up the amenities, correctly configuring them so that we could earn maximum revenue from them, and then I was finally ready to release the Dilophosaurs, who had a nice enclosure already made for them, so I asked for them to be delivered there. I then went on what I could only describe as an Elon Musk style firing spree, as these scientists were no longer good enough for my needs. After firing them all though, I hired some better but more expensive people to be my new scientist team. I then decided to go undercover and sat in a jeep ride to see how our new Dilophosaurs were settling in. In fact, I was enjoying this tour ride so much that I decided to actually join the other tour at the bottom of the park where the Ceratosaurs were. As I've already mentioned, the health and safety of this seemed a little bit questionable, but hey, if it was providing me money in the pocket, I was happy. Back to my actual job now of running the park though, it appeared that one of my Nasutoceratops had become ill, so I sent out a paleo vet to look into that, while I placed down a viewing gallery inside the enclosure where guests could see the dinosaurs. Just after that, as day 10 dawned, the financials came across my desk, and we were looking good, with some solid profit coming in and just shy of a 3-star park rating. Jurassic Park under my leadership was on the up, but we still had a long way to go, but with contracts like these, it would help a lot. They wanted me to boost the revenue of the park, so I just fully embraced capitalism and put down a few swanky 5-star hotels for the rich guests to stay at, so they could lounge in a pool while looking at a Styracosaurus. This was successful in boosting our revenue, but just when everything was going well, a storm came in. So obviously I opened all the emergency shelters, as we all know what happens to Jurassic Park when a storm hits, it all goes to shit. That night, me and the response teams worked hard, repairing all the fences, generators, pylons, and everything else that had been affected by the storm. And there was quite a lot. Once the sunny skies had returned and everything essential was repaired, I could happily reopen the shelters and boast that, as of yet, a single guest had yet to be eaten by a dinosaur. There were still a couple of minor repairs that needed to be made, but nothing major. Although I did need a few more emergency shelters, so I made sure to place those down to get our safety rating up to 100%, so that guests felt safe to visit Jurassic Park. But now it was time to send out our dig team, and this time it was time to go after something a little bit different, and go after the DNA of our first marine species, as eventually I for sure wanted to get ourselves our very own lagoon in Jurassic Park. The first species that I wanted was the Liopleurodon, famous for its portrayal in Walking with Dinosaurs of course. But first, I already had far too many fossils that already needed extracting, and the park was facing a new issue. Apparently, we had too many guests for the paths, and they were now incredibly overcrowded. Now, to be fair to our guests here, there is nothing worse than paths you can barely move on, so I got to work on making our paths a little bit thicker so that more guests could walk on them. Unfortunately, this mission was forced to take a bit of a back seat when I was told that the Deinonychus pack had started a breakout down at the bottom of the park. There is a reason that I put them down here away from any actual walking guests, because if this had been the top of the park, this would have been a complete disaster for sure. So I obviously had the Deinonychuses tranquilized and the fences repaired, and all in all, no harm was really done. I make that Rampy 1, escape Dinosaurs 0. And later that day, I was told that some Wuherosauruses had been spotted roaming St. Petersburg. So I obviously sent my thrilled expedition team to Russia to capture these dinosaurs, as the more dinosaurs we had on display the better. The only problem was that my existing staff were pretty busy already, so I had to hire some new ones who did an excellent job in capturing them and bringing them home. But after they were actually captured, we had a new problem. None of my current enclosures were going to be suitable for our new attractions, as they would either fight with our other herbivores or probably be eaten by the carnivores, which meant that I had to make them a nice new enclosure. This was fine though, as I still had plenty of room left in the park for new exhibits, so after placing an enclosure down, I got the latest financials and latest contracts through. I opted to try and increase the number of guests in the park, as that would mean more ticket sales, which was a win-win. After that, I had to research the treatment for infected wound to help keep our dinosaurs healthy, and then I sent out a team to search for fossils for the Stegosaurus, as apparently this was one of the original dinosaurs in the original park. The good thing about these little scavengers is that they just love everything and everyone, and were happy to be put in with any dinosaur at all. This meant I was able to release them directly out of the hatchery and into the enclosure with all the rest of the herbivores. They would want a little bit of sand in there, so I added some sand in for them and then sent out yet another dig team to my homeland of the UK to look for the DNA for a Proceratosaurus, another original dinosaur from Jurassic Park, which meant of course it had to be in mine also. Once the fossils were back, I of course extracted them and then set about creating my own Proceratosaurus army. But before I could finish setting them up with a new home, I was interrupted by the offer of some more Wuherosauruses. Apparently these guys are just walking about everywhere at this stage. As we already had a good amount of these dinos, I decided to actually decline this opportunity. I just needed to work out exactly where I was going to deliver our precious Proceratosaurus army to, and after a lot of work and thought process, I decided to split the Wuherosaurus enclosure into two so the animals would be split apart. This was a good idea in theory, until I had a bit of a brain blank moment when delivering the Proceratosaurus and just fully put them in the enclosure with the herbivores that I was trying to avoid. So then I had to tranquilize all the Wuherosaurs and move them over into the enclosure next to them. It was a bit of a messy day in Jurassic Park, but the main thing was we were getting more dinosaurs in the park for the guests to view. Plus we did successfully complete a contract in the process. While this was all being sorted out by the staff, I had a look at our park statistics, particularly analysing that appeal rating, just so that I could see what ways the guests wanted to improve the park a little bit. After that, I watched our new attraction get settled in, and as they had some dominance fights, I then realised that one of our Wuherosauruses had broken the fence and escaped, which might have had something to do with the fact that I'd accidentally put a sole Proceratosaurus in its brand new exhibit, so it decided to make a run for the hills, which I respected. But it had to go back in the pen, so I tranked it out and had it transported, before being dragged down to the bottom of the park, where our very naughty Deinonychuses were bloody escaping again. Not quite sure why, they were perfectly happy in there and there were no guests nearby to break out to try and eat, but they just decided to try and escape. Still, as I had to repair their enclosure for what must have been the third time now, I decided it was time to invest some serious cash and my scientist's time in unlocking the heavy fence. The heavy fence was security rating 5, which meant that only the biggest carnivores would be able to break it, and we weren't quite at that level yet. So this was going to hopefully stop any chance of an escape for all of the creatures in the whole of Jurassic Park that we had at the moment. Once I had finally unlocked the fence, I made sure that the entire Deinonychus enclosure was now surrounded by these heavy fences, so that I wouldn't have to waste my time dealing with their cheeky escape attempts again. Once the enclosure was secure, I had the tranquilized dinos transported back in there, and then I finally got on the sole Proceratosaurus, who had been casually living his life surrounded by Wuherosaurs. Somehow though, no one was harmed or injured in this experiment, and I had it tranquilized and put back with the rest of its kind. For the rest of the day, I decided to replace the entire park fences with the heavy-duty ones, as I had found out during my time building Jurassic World, dinosaur escapes can have a hugely detrimental effect not only on a park's finances, but also a park's reputation, and we definitely could do without that. Once this was done, I decided to pay to research the advanced amenities, which would allow us to place down large amenity buildings to satisfy our rapidly growing guests. I then saw that one of our Stegosauruses was suffering from internal bleeding, which was likely due to fighting amongst its own kind, which was pretty frustrating as I was going to have to tranquilize it and then get it sent to the paleomedical facility as soon as possible. Checking in on our Proceratosaurus, it appeared that they had also been scuffling, although thankfully no internal bleeding had been suffered here. I replaced a final bit of fence that I had somehow managed to miss out when originally replacing, and then almost let this escaped tranquilized Wuherosaurus wake up from its slumber without being put back into its enclosure. Thankfully, just in time I realised my mistake and asked the transport team to sort it. I placed down another 5-star hotel to keep those millionaire guests happy, and this one boasted a view of the Herrerasaur paddock. I followed this up by placing down a cinema, because who doesn't want to watch Jurassic Park the movie while visiting my own version of Jurassic Park? Jokes aside, cinemas and similar attractions were good for attracting more guests and would increase the appeal rating of the park. I was then notified about the opportunity to capture a sole wandering Majungasaurus, but perhaps surprisingly I chose to turn it down. I was intent on rebuilding Jurassic Park with both original dinos and planned dinosaurs that were due to come down the line. We had some big dinosaurs to come, and I didn't think that many of them would fancy sharing territory with a sole Majungasaurus. Our Dilophosaurs were apparently intent on trying to escape their enclosure, but I was pretty confident that they were going to be contained just fine.
Release me!
Although I did think that the paleomedical team weren't going to be too happy, as they kept getting injured trying to escape. I sent out a dig team to Mongolia to look primarily for Gallimimus DNA, another one of course of the original dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. Unfortunately though, we didn't quite get enough DNA from that expedition to make the genome just yet. I then messed around with our amenities for a little bit to make sure that we were maximising our profit, and had a look at the park statistics. Adding and tinkering with the amenities a little bit made a big difference, and we were now actually over a 4-star park rating, which meant we were well on our way to achieving that prestigious 5-star rank that would really solidify us as the real deal. The next dinosaur though that I'd set my sights on was the iconic Brachiosaurus, which would hopefully have guests looking like Alan Grant when he saw a dinosaur for the first time. To be able to dig for the Brachiosaur DNA though, I had quite a lot of researching to do, as they were one of the most highly sought after sauropods. But after researching everything that I needed to, I sent out a team for some DNA, and then got it back to the lab for extracting, and then I could suddenly make myself some Brachiosauruses. I didn't waste any time in doing so either, and cooked up a pair of them in the lab, and then watched them gracefully enter their enclosure for the first time. Now Jurassic Park now had their very first sauropods, a very nice addition to our park. Of course, satisfying their needs would be a slight challenge, as Brachiosaurs do like to eat a lot, so they would need to be surrounded by forest and also a lot of tall nut trees, which could be difficult. Once I had done my best to provide them with what they needed, I saw on a map that there was going to be some wild Gallimimus available for capture in Brussels, which I certainly was not going to turn down, as I of course wanted to have a herd of these in the park. We managed to capture 7 of them, and decided to put them in with the Wuherosaurus, as they were apparently fans of them. But while they were delivered, I was very busy back at the bottom of the park, building a new enclosure and even a hatchery, and I had a good reason for that. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it was finally time to unleash the raptors. Once incubated, I released our raptors into the park, and hoped that in this 100 days journey, they would not live up to their villainous reputation of the films. Of course, I had stationed them deliberately down here away from the guests, to try and make sure of that. Guests really did seem to love our Jurassic Park though, and revenue was increasing all the time, which meant that I was able to send out more and more dig teams so that we could create some more dinosaurs. Next on our list was another park OG in the Metriocanthosaurus, another dinosaur to inhabit my homeland of the UK. Once back from the UK, I extracted the DNA so I could cook some up in the lab, but I was then pulled away as I saw one of my Morris Intrepidus was actually doing a very poor job of looking after himself. I sort of realised at this point that I didn't actually have a paleo vet down here at the bottom of the park, so I added one in and then assigned them to all of the enclosures down here, as the addition of the raptors meant that we had quite a few species down here at the very bottom of the park. Later that day, I had a report that some wild Ankies were available, and I was certainly not going to turn that down, and 2 out of 4 of them were successfully captured. I put them in with the Brachiosauruses and the other herbivores, as apparently they liked everything in there, so that would be a good match for them, and they would be on good show for the guests at all times, which would be popular, as everyone loves an Anki. Our pathways though were still struggling with capacity issues, so I unlocked the wide path. Now, please be kind to me in the comments about my path making skills. I get it, I suck at them.
Oh my god! What is that?
But the main thing was that when it had finished, the guests were a little bit less cramped on the paths at least. I then also decided to place down some more viewing galleries in pretty much all of our enclosures. Currently, the main way for the guests to view all of our dinosaurs was via the park tour, but I thought that a bit of variety would be nice for them so they wouldn't be stuck on the car the entire time, and of course we've seen how health and safety those cars look, and it doesn't look great. These log viewing galleries had cost $2 million to research on their own, but did provide a fantastic review of our Brachiosauruses right here. It made me jealous that I wasn't there myself. The next day I got one of our best capture reports yet, which was the opportunity to capture some Dreadnoughtuses, and I was not going to turn this one down for sure, even if the original Jurassic Park didn't have them in it. And soon it was not long before one of the largest dinosaurs to ever walk the earth was in our park, and would now be one of our star attractions on display. I actually put them in with the Deinonychuses down here because they were so big that the dinos just simply would get out of their way and leave them alone. Great use of space, I thought. But space was certainly becoming a bit of an issue, and I had to begin at looking at adding some new enclosures for any incoming dinos, one of course being the Metriocanthosaurus, which was going to be our next addition when we had the funds. If I was going to have dinosaurs in these enclosures, of course, I would need to have a park tour that guests could view them from, so I had to plot a brand new tour route and route all through our enclosures, which ultimately led to a brand new area of the park, which we hadn't built in yet, but more on that in just a second. First, it was time to incubate our 5 Metriocanthosaurs, which was going to cost a whopping $6.75 million. There was no doubt that these dinosaurs were getting seriously expensive, and I was going to need to increase our revenue if we wanted to keep this up. Which is exactly why, after getting our Metrios airlifted to their new home, it was time to start on the Lagoon project. No longer would we be held back by the constraints of the original park, it was time to branch out and embrace the future of the 21st century. Our very watery future. Of course I had to first of all put a path all the way down to our new lagoon, and also make sure it was all powered by some electricity. Once that was done, I could place down a lagoon hatchery, and also a response unit who would deal with any of the marine issues, as well as some of the local nearby dinosaurs. Our first species that we were actually going to release was the Liplorodon. I placed down a marine viewing platform, which would allow the guests to see our precious additions to the park. Not really quite sure how they get to this viewing dome, but not my problem. Once that was done, it was time to release the Liplorodons. And while this was still one of the smaller aquatic predators that we could possibly get our hands on, it still looked pretty terrifying to me. I placed down an amenity next to the marine lagoon to attract some guests in, and was then presented with the opportunity to capture myself some compies. So I thought why not, and put them in with the Metriacanthosaurs. And no, you'll be amazed to know that they apparently don't eat them, and they're actually best mates. But with our marine lagoon now up and running, it was time to turn our attention to what was going to be the star attraction of Jurassic Park for quite some time to come, the Tylosaurus. I sent out a fossil team to get that beautiful DNA, and when they returned I extracted them to make ourselves a Tylosaur. Our scientists were in need of a bit of a rest now though, so I sent them all to the Maldives before making 3 Tylosaur eggs, although I was nowhere near the $4 million needed to finish incubating them. The latest park financials were now across my desk, and we had also hit day 50, which was a great fitting time to hit that 5-star park rating. Despite that though, our monthly income had actually gone down from the previous month, which was likely due to our dinosaurs just not being exciting enough anymore. Hopefully our brand new Tylosaurs were about to fix that problem, as these things had quite the appeal rating. Before that though, as our park had got bigger, its transport rating had dropped, as apparently our poor guests were having to walk from one enclosure to the next. My heart truly weeps for them. But anyways, as always guys, the customer is always right in this situation. So I then had to insert a monorail station into Jurassic Park. I know the monorail doesn't strictly belong here, rather 20 years down the line in Jurassic World, but apparently it was the only way to keep my guests happy. After spending a long time building my monorail station and placing down the stations, just as I was about to open it up, I got alerted to some more wild ankylosaurs. So I of course sent the capture team out to secure them, but somehow they only managed to get 1 out of 4, which was a pretty poor job I must say. Still, an extra Anky was nothing to complain about, so I put him in with the rest of his kind. I placed down an additional power station to make sure that we weren't about to run out of any power, and then just put my feet up and let the money flow in, because I had pretty much no choice as these Tylosaurs were about to drain everything that I had. After a small wait though, we were finally ready to release the new star attractions to Jurassic Park, the Tylosaur. Interestingly, according to some park maps and I believe one of the Jurassic Park games, Jurassic Park actually did have a Tylosaur, so it was a pretty cool moment to have 3 of them on show for the guests to see. I expanded the lagoon slightly so the Tylosaurs had enough space, as these were some seriously big creatures, and then left to check on our Metriacanthosaurs, who were incredibly popular with the guests, and they seemed to be behaving themselves, which was always a nice bonus for me. I then checked out the view from one of our hotels, and it was a little bit questionable to say the least. Not quite sure this is what our 5-star guests had in mind, but no complaints yet, so I was happy. Surprisingly, the raptors also actually seemed to be behaving themselves, and my Jurassic Park had in general been rather secure. So of course, I didn't want the fear factor to leave the guests' minds, so I did the sensible thing and went and learned the research for the Spinosaurus. And with that learnt, I was about to send out a dig team to search some Spinosaurus DNA, only to have to wait a little bit as it was rather costly. And I also had to upgrade my staff a little bit, as you needed some top tier staff to dig for Spinosaurus fossils. After sending my staff on the training day of a lifetime, probably to the Maldives knowing them, I could finally ship them off to Africa to dig for some Spino DNA. Once they were back, I extracted the DNA, and then realised that I had a problem. I wasn't sure where I was going to put said Spinosaurus once we had one. So I decided to make the brave move of tranquilising our Herrerasaurs and then selling them on the dinosaur black market. Where they went after that was none of my concern, and I'm sure it was to a fantastic home of course. I got a small amount of money for each of the Herrerasaurs, which was a good job as a Spinosaurus does not come cheap. After synthesizing the egg, I then had to wait until I had the actual cash to actually incubate it. So while I was waiting for that to happen, I hopped around the park checking out the view from my marine viewing dome, which was absolutely cracking by the way, and then giving my new compies that had arrived some sand to keep them happy. When I completed a contract to keep my dinosaurs disease free, I had the money to incubate my Spino egg, only to then realise that my scientists were too undercooked to be able to perform such tasks. So instead I had to fire one of our poor scientists and hire a new one instead, and then we could finally incubate the egg. The Spino was obviously going to be placed in the previously inhabited Herrerasaur enclosure, only then I realised when I was placing it in that I'd actually missed out one of the Herrerasaurs, which I was meant to be sold on the black market. So while the Spino was being airlifted, I had to sort that one out. I checked in on our Tylosaurs, who were mostly happy, although they were craving a little bit more open space. Unfortunately, my Jurassic Park was a little bit packed at this point, and I had no room to expand the lagoon at all, so they would just have to make do. I then watched our new star attraction being hoisted into the air, but was disturbed by the offer of some flying reptile thing that I'm not going to try and pronounce. Honestly, I would have loved to have had an aviary in Jurassic Park, but we simply just did not have the space, so I had to pass up on this capture offer. Maybe we'll have one in Jurassic Park San Diego, and I get to build that one down the line. Our Spinosaurus had now landed and was getting accustomed with his new environment. Of course, being an aquatic creature, it wanted far more water than the previous occupiers had had, so I first had to sort that out. It didn't take too long though for our Spino to get up to mischief and start terrorising the guests on the park tour, and I decided to name him Darren. I enjoyed spending the evening watching Darren be an absolute menace, sending jeeps flying up into the air, and after getting rid of some of the forest that he didn't require so the guests could get a great view of him, I watched him square one-on-one up to our ranger team. I could tell right from the start that Big Dazza here was going to be trouble. Back in the lagoon, it appeared that our poor live pleurodons had contracted tuberculosis, so I had to research the cure for them, and I then completely embraced my inner Jurassic world and placed down an innovation centre as the guests just loved it and it brought me in more money. I'm a disgrace, I know. I placed down a paleomedical facility next to the lagoon, unlocked medium carnivores via researching them, and then decided to release some oviraptors because why not? But the big news today was that we'd also gained access to the Tyrannosaurus Rex genome after researching Large Carnivores 1. We of course wanted a Tyrannosaurus Rex in our park, but the only problem was that this digging for Rex DNA was a very expensive task, costing $2 million each time I sent the scientist team out there. It was also why I was particularly annoyed when the fossils came back the first time and we had acquired 49% of the genome, a sole 1% off we would actually need to be able to make some Rexes. I then caught Big Dazza by the fence, which appeared to have a bit of a crack in it. I was slightly concerned that he was about to break out of it, which is why it was not a good time to be notified of some useless dinosaur on the loose that I did not want to capture for my park. Thankfully, Darren did decide to move on from the damaged wall, and the ranger team got right out to fix it just in time. Unfortunately for me though, Darren had moved on from the wall because he decided to amuse himself by outright bullying the guests on the park tour vehicles, refusing to let them out of the enclosure and just being an absolute general menace. At this point, Darren was top of my naughty list, and he would definitely not be getting a present from Raptor Claws this year. Eventually Darren did get bored and moved away, letting the vehicles leave, and I decided to check my financials, and oh boy were they a beautiful sight. The profit was at an all-time high, and the appeal rating had skyrocketed since the introduction of course of our Tylosaurs and Darren the Spinosaur, meaning we were at a great place. But the job was certainly not done yet, as it's just not Jurassic Park without some T-Rexes. So after Dig Team came back with yet more DNA, it was time to start cooking up some Rexes in the lab. But not quite yet because I was low on funds again. Turns out making all these expensive dinos is very costly. I got a notification about a wandering Allosaurus in the wild. This was actually pretty perfect actually, as if you didn't know, apparently the Allosaurus and the Ceratosaurus are best mates in the wild, so the Allo could just go straight into the Ceratosaur enclosure when it was captured. And now we could proudly display the alpha carnivore of the Jurassic period at Jurassic Park. Once he was in, there was only one name for this Allo of course, which was of course Big Al. He wanted a little bit more forest compared to the Ceratosaurs, so I added that in to help him feel right at home. But across the park in bigger news, our Tyrannosaurs were now ready to be delivered. I already had an empty pre-made enclosure for them right next to the Metriacanthosaurs, as of course I knew I wanted to have some Rexes at Jurassic Park of course at some stage, so I kept one free for them. I did expand it a little bit as they were being delivered though, to give them a little bit more room. When they touched down on their new sandy ground, I named them both Terrence and Matilda. I did my best to both satisfy their needs, which was a bit tricky as Rexes have a lot of needs. Of course, immediately they began to fight for some dominance, but when Matilda retreated, Terrence was crowned as the alpha of the two of them. I spent the next day just trying to keep my Rexes happy, as I've seen firsthand what happens when these things break out, and it isn't pretty. They wanted quite a lot of forest, so I actually decided to extend their enclosure again in the hopes it would keep them content. Oh, how wrong I was. But anyway, we might have had the Spino and some Rexes now, but there was still one more apex carnivore that we didn't have yet that I wanted. So off the dig team went to Argentina to search some Giganotosaurus DNA. When they were back, I continually extracted the DNA, and was pleased to see that we'd actually had enough DNA from one trip there, so was able to immediately make up some Gigas. The next rather large question though was where was I going to place these Gigas? Well, luckily I had been thinking about this and figured that I had just about enough room at the very bottom of the park to squeeze in a nice big enclosure for our Gigas. And as I watched our Gigas get airlifted to their new home, I then got notification that Terrence was hunting down the Gallimimus. Slightly strange, I thought, as no Gallimimus were actually in with Terrence. No, you see, Terrence had got a little bit bored in his enclosure, and when he smelt that sweet Gallimimus next door, he had gone and busted down a concrete wall to get access to them, and now helped himself to a nice snack. Meanwhile, Matilda had also wandered in, and both the Wuherosauruses and Gallimimus were absolutely panicking, and understandably so. So I sent out a capture team to trank the Rexes, and while this whole ordeal wasn't exactly great, I would actually rather him eat a poor dinosaur than a guest, mainly because the dead Gallimimus family can't sue me. Down at the bottom of the park, our Giganotosaurus duo were apparently planning their breakout attempt, so I was panicking a little bit, trying to make sure they were completely happy to reduce the risk of this. But just as I thought that I was really getting a handle on this, I found Darren, yes Darren the Spinosaur, out of his enclosure, taking a nap, which I presume was after he'd eaten a nice guest. Jurassic Park was unravelling before my eyes a little bit, and I was beginning to panic. So obviously, as we had a Spinosaur on the loose, I opened all the shelters so the guests could run for safety. Unfortunately, there was actually a singular shelter behind the Spinosaurus that a few of the guests decided to run to. But then again, I came to the conclusion that if the guests were stupid enough to try and sneak past the sleeping Spinosaurus, the world wouldn't be missing much anyway. So Darren was now tranquilized and put back in his enclosure, and all was back to normal. Until of course I caught our Giganotosaurus duo trying to break down the fence so they could reach the Dreadnoughtuses. Thankfully, I'd recognised this just in time and repaired the fence before all hell broke loose. I was sort of missing the days of the Herrerasaurs and the nice calm carnivores that couldn't break down these fences at this point. As these Gigas were being pretty troublesome, there was only one name for this male here, which was Ryan, and if you watch my 100 Days Jurassic World video, you will know exactly why. I named the other one Kelly, as this was Ryan's partner in crime. But back at the top of the park, while I'd been focusing on Ryan and Kelly, we had some very bad news. Darren had broken back out again. This time, instead of taking a nap, he had ran straight down the main high street, eating and trampling guests everywhere he went. I could literally smell the lawyer fees. This was going to be a disaster to say the least, but I did open all the emergency shelters, but it was too late for a lot of our poor guests. As Darren seemed to enjoy breaking out, once he was knocked out, I decided to bring back a good old trick that I'd learned on Jurassic World, which was the double wall trick. Essentially, once Darren broke through one wall, he would just be met with another, which would hopefully stop him from breaking out completely. But it just kept going from bad to worse, as I then realised that Terrence was also on the loose and murdering Gallimimuses again. At least this time he'd committed the murder in his own enclosure, but still it was another casualty for our herd of Gallimimuses. I then saw that our park tours were a little bit stuck. I wasn't quite sure how to fix this, and I did try and drive one of our vehicles myself to smash the cars out of the way, but for some reason it just wouldn't let me do this, which was a little bit annoying. So instead I had to delete part of the track of the tours and then replace it once the backlog had cleared. And it turns out that delayed park tours are actually a theme of the day. This Ceratosaur had been tranquilised by the capture team, I assume for attacking a vehicle or something, which wasn't great considering it had fell asleep directly on the park tour track, meaning that they were all just stuck in place waiting for it to wake up. But with Darren now secured with a double fence, and Terrence and Matilda behaving themselves for now, I wanted to turn my attention to the final attraction of Jurassic Park. You see, our guests were no longer impressed by regular dinosaurs anymore. They wanted something bigger, scarier, more teeth. But before we could look into that any further, I would need to 100% the Tyrannosaur genome, which was not going to be cheap. In between sending out the dig team constantly to extract DNA for the Rex, I had to deal with Ryan. And Ryan being Ryan, he was escaping from his enclosure. I'm not really quite sure why the capture team hadn't been watching him, but there we go. After Ryan was tranquilised and put back into his enclosure, we sent out the dig team once more, and on day 90 we had finally completed the Tyrannosaur genome. Now, I'm sure to no one's surprise at all, we were doing this to bring the Indominus Rex to Jurassic Park. I'd already completed John Hammond's dream and got Jurassic Park successfully up and running. Now, it was time to splice in a little bit of Simon Masserani's also, and provide that wow factor. Unfortunately though, there was one small problem. It was very, very expensive. It cost 10 million just to be able to research the Indominus, so we just had to sit tight, put our feet up, and wait for the money to come on in. Although, as this was Jurassic Park, and now full of man-eating dinosaurs that kept trying to escape, it was less putting my feet up, and more watching every single one of these big carnivores like a hawk to see what they were up to for about 8 days. On day 98 though, $10 million later, and I was finally able to create an Indominus Rex. And after a little bit more waiting until I had the cash to synthesize the egg, I finally had one cooking. Of course, I then found myself sorting out Ryan and Kelly once more. Clearly they weren't working down here at all, so I decided to introduce a little bit of chaos into the mix, and have them move to another exhibit, where instead of breaking down the walls, they could hunt the other dinosaurs. As you can tell, I was ready for my retirement at this time. But first, it was time to get the Indominus Rex paddock placed down. A creature like this would need a super secure enclosure to stop it from escaping, as we would not want that. While I waited for the Indominus to be delivered, I of course watched Ryan and Kelly murder a poor Gallimimus, and these guys had a really tough ride in my park, it has to be said. But I was now about to be seated for the arrival of the most dangerous predator to ever step foot on Earth. With a VIP seat, I blended in with the rest of the park guests to see the moment my precious Indominus Rex was delivered. We finally had our true star attraction, and all was well in the world. Jurassic Park was back. Hang on a minute, why has it just walked out of the paddock? Oh god. John, it's happening again. Thank you all for watching my 100 Days to Save Jurassic Park. I had a blast filming this video and bringing Isla Nublar 1993 to life. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe if you are new around here, as it truly does help support the channel. Let me know if you want me to do Jurassic Park San Diego next in the comments below, and also check out my Patreon linked in the description if you guys want early access to all of these videos. Take care of yourselves and have a great rest of your day. I'll see you guys in the next one.